Now I'm going to show you pictures from the greatest and largest religious complex in the world. I found the visit to Karnak in Ammon's temple immensely satisfying for many reasons, but in part because when I was a young teen, I read an excellent novel set in ancient Egyptian times that centered on the city of Thebes, or Luxor it is known today, and the great temple there. The book was written by Mecca Waltari and is titled The Egyptian. I went up to the top deck at dawn to look at the hills on the west side of the Nile as the sun was coming up, as have untold numbers of people for thousands and thousands of years. Off in the distance, on the west side of the Nile, it looked like maybe trouble was brewing. Yes, there was no doubt about it. A large balloon uprising was taking place over there. And the fishermen were already out. But nothing was stirring at the Hilton. However, we soon left the boat for our buses and the short trip to the Karnak temple. I should mention here that the weather was warm but dry, and only once around 2 p.m. did I ever feel uncomfortably hot. I was surprised and pleased to find the heat of Egypt so easy to take. The most powerful god of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt was Ammon. His name means the hidden one, but his temple and the vast land and wealth that his priests controlled in his name was anything but hidden. It is said that Ammon owned a full 1/3 of Egypt's farmland and the people who worked it. When you see this temple complex, so huge that St. Peter's and the Vatican in Rome would fit into one corner, you know how powerful the worship of this god was. There is good evidence that Akhenaten's heresy, where he tried to supplant Ammon with the sun god Anton, was an attempt to break this overwhelming power of the priests. In the end, the god proved too powerful, because not only did he own everything, but all the professional people, from scribes to doctors, had to come to the temple for training and certification. The influence of Ammon was felt all over the ancient world too. There is good evidence that the Christian word amen, that Jesus said before and after important statements, and even today Christians say after prayer, comes from the common way of verifying the truth of your statement. In other words, I swear by Ammon what I'm saying is true. And as a matter of fact, Amen is a common alternative spelling and pronunciation of Ammon. As a matter of fact, there are many alternate spellings and pronunciations, such as Ammon, Amen, Amen, Amun-Ra, and probably many others too. Anyway, back to this religious center. You know, for over 1,500 years, pharaohs added to the grandeur of this temple complex, attesting to the power of this god had over the people of Egypt. Well, after breakfast, the buses were loaded by 8:30 for a departure time of 9 a.m. I told you this was the most neurotically on-time bunch of people I ever met. So there they were, sitting in the bus for over half an hour, waiting for the buses to leave. Anyway, the distance from our boat to the temple complex was just over a mile, but we went by bus anyway. By 9:10, we were already at the famous Avenue of the Rams, leading to the first pylon, which is the entrance to the great temple. In this photo, you might notice that the right pylon is taller than the left pylon shown in the previous picture. Evidently, the left one was never finished. The rams here are one of the symbols of Ammon, and people wore ram horns as decorations, like people wear crosses today. After the first pylon, we entered a large courtyard with large columns and ram statues on one side and the temple of Ramesses III on the other. The courtyard opened into yet another pylon, which led deeper into the temple complex. Strangely, some of the stonework and one of the columns looked like it had never been finished, but even today it can be seen in its original uncarved form. The temple of Ramesses III on the south side of the first courtyard between the first and second pylons. Looking through the opening of the second pylon into once was the interior. The second pylon opens into the columns of the great hypostyle court. The center columns were carved in a lotus shape and are about 70 feet high, just huge. Entering the hypostyle court, many of the huge columns are still standing, but much of the stone roof is nearly all missing. The truth is, I did not have a map of the very complex layout of this temple, so I didn't really know where I was most of the time. So I just took a lot of pictures of what I thought was interesting. At the end of the great hypostyle hall, after the fourth pylon, you find Queen Hatshepsut's obelisks. These obelisks were raised by Queen Hatshepsut, but her cartouches, those oval hieroglyphs that contained people's names, were chiseled out, and her nephew's name, Thutmose III, was substituted. Evidently, there was a great hatred between Thutmose and Aunt Hattie, because after she died, he had all of her statues smashed and all of her names on things erased out. Fortunately, he and his men missed a lot of things, and the attempts to overwrite wasn't always successful. This particular obelisk has a big chip out of it, but is in otherwise pretty good shape after 3,500 years. The oval filled with hieroglyphs is a cartouche, and I believe it says Hatshepsut. It was way up on the obelisk, so maybe Thutmose III didn't notice it or couldn't get to it. Aunt Hattie put up several obelisks in this part of the temple, but most have fallen and broken. They are made of a very hard and very strong pink granite rock and carved to shape without machines. From a distance, they look perfect, but the angles were done by eye, and the workmen had to take into account the original shape of the granite shafts. If you look closely, the surface is not perfectly square and not perfectly flat. Off to the south of the main temple, you can see the ruins of a couple of the several other pylons that head toward the Luxor temple about 1.5 miles away. In ancient times, a huge and spectacular holiday called the Opet Festival would take the god's statue on a procession to the Luxor temple for a short visit and then back home again. This is the far or east end of the temple, looking at the south wall. The most important and holiest sections of the temple were at this end. There is still a lot of restoration work needed. With the temple to the right, the remains of the sacred pool where the priests would wash and purify everything is to our left. The water wasn't very pure looking, but if your pool hadn't been cleaned in 3,500 years, I'd say it would probably look worse. As mentioned, the holiest parts were at this end, but a lot of it is in ruins, and I really didn't know what I was looking at. While wandering around, I did run across some real archaeologists doing some investigating. Something was going on, and I was dying to ask the guy, but I figured he probably had enough dumb questions from tourists, so I took pity and didn't disturb them. This and the next couple of pictures show fragments that appear to have been sorted for later restoration. Here is the Gate of Nectanebo I. Don't ask me who he was, but it sure was a fantastic gate in the old wall. Can you imagine what the walls, and they were probably made of adobe brick, what the walls must have looked like when with a gate like this? It must have looked fantastic. Another view of the gate. It's just huge. You can see some of the adobe brickwork. By the way, this gate opens to the rear of the temple complex and probably allowed the common people of Thebes to enter the grounds of the temple. The morning was over, and I exited the front of the temple to catch the bus. We were told we could have an hour to explore the temple on our own or go back to the buses. Naturally, I spent the time exploring, while nearly everybody else left the temple right away so that they wouldn't be late for the bus. Like I said, this was the most on-time bunch of people I've ever met. Anyway, I got to the bus about 10 minutes early, and right on time, they pulled out. By the way, here's what the Avenue of the Sphinxes look like from the rear. Before going back to the boat for lunch and to wait out the hottest part of the day, some of us visited the famous Brooks Animal Hospital. This is a veterinary clinic for the sick and injured horses and donkeys that belong to owners too poor to pay for regular treatment. In my opinion, the whole thing is pretty much a scam. Yes, they did have a few darling little horses and donkeys, and some of them were banged up and had festering wounds, but the facility was way too small to have any real impact on the equine health of this huge region of Egypt. Not only that, when I went poking around in the back rooms, I noticed junky equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in years stored away back there. No, as far as I was concerned, this was basically a banged-up horse petting zoo strictly for us tourists. I did not leave a donation in the big plastic box at the entrance. I have to admit though, I sure felt a great affection for those animals they had in there. I guess I really do love horses. If you can see them, there were a lot of fish swimming around in the clear waters of the Nile between the bank and our boat. Rather than take a siesta, I went to the top deck after lunch and took a couple of long-range pictures of the cruise boats off the coast and docked at Luxor. I really should have gone down for my other camera with the long-range lens. Don't know if you can see it through the haze, but the tour boats are all lined up several deep at the main docking facilities there at Luxor. I lost count around 60 when I tried to count all the cruise boats. Amr, my guide, told me there are something like 180 boats on the Nile at any one time. Anyway, it was a bit warm, but not unpleasantly so, even in the early afternoon. By now, it was late afternoon, and the air was cooling off. We got back on the buses for the 3-mile ride down to the Luxor temple. This temple is much smaller than Karnak, but quite beautiful. Naturally, it was also built as part of the worship of Ammon, and it had chapels to his wife Mut and their boy Khonsu. I entered at the north end of the temple complex along the Avenue of the Sphinxes. This avenue used to extend 1.5 miles to the south side of the Karnak temple, but it is broken in the center by modern Luxor. I walked down the avenue to the first pylon and then entered the court of Ramesses II. I'll keep this map up for a few more seconds so you can get familiar with the layout of the temple. Approaching the Luxor temple from the north along the Avenue of the Sphinxes. Here's one of the Sphinx statues that is still in pretty good condition. As I'm approaching the first pylon, you can see the colossal statues of Ramesses and the obelisk to the left of the entrance. The guide is telling something about the obelisk, probably that it was erected by Hatshepsut but claimed by Thutmose III. And here's a shot of the inside of the court of Ramesses. At the south end of the court of Ramesses, there are these huge statues of him with a hall of huge columns called the colonnade behind. A closer look at the right statue. Another view of the right statue with the colonnade in the background. And a close-up of the remarkably well-preserved image of Ramesses II. You will notice with this and some following statues of Ramesses that he wasn't at all modest about having his statues displayed. Here's the large figure on the left and a scene from his chair. To the left of the statues and the entrance to the colonnade are more but smaller statues in various states of preservation. The best preserved of the small statues. And one slightly damaged with the crown of Lower Egypt broken off. And here he has completely lost his head and the special crown too. Entering into the colonnade, one can't help but be impressed with their size and how well preserved the hieroglyphics are. I assume there was some sort of stone roof over this walkway, but now only part of the huge stones are still up there. Here's a telephoto shot of the lotus-shaped top of the column. Even the very tops were carved, painted, and decorated. From the court of Amenhotep, looking back at the colonnade and the first pylon in the background. And a close-up of the top of the south end of the colonnade. Obviously the roof beams extended to a pylon that formed the entrance to the court where I'm now standing. And here I am looking south into the court of Amenhotep. I am now in the court of Amenhotep and looking around at the columns surrounding this courtyard. At the south end of the court begins the many columns that held up the roof of the hypostyle hall that formed the entrance to the temple. Past the hypostyle hall and into the temple itself, there is this large stone shrine room or temple sanctuary that was built by Alexander the Great. Nobody but priests were ever allowed in there. Here are some propaganda scenes showing Alexander on the right being given authority by the god of earthly kingship, Horus, on the left there, and sanctioned by Ammon himself further to the left. Some of the reliefs were exquisitely carved into hard granite. No room for mistakes. If the chisel slipped, the entire block of stone would be ruined. Those that wanted to could stay until 6:30 p.m., but nearly everybody but me got back to the bus by 5:45, and then just sat there. You know, like if they didn't get there early, the bus would have left without them. I snapped my last picture at 6:15 and then headed for the bus myself. At 6:40, I watched the sun going down on the west side of the Nile, as others have for thousands and thousands of years. Back on board the boat, we were treated to a folkloric show. The performers were very good, and they served an excellent Egyptian beer and I drank enough of it to really enjoy myself. The featured entertainer was a guy dressed up as a whirling dervish. He wasn't a real Sufi dervish, but an entertainer. I didn't think I was going to like seeing some guy in a dress spinning around, but the guy was good, really, really good, and I really enjoyed the performance.